He was a ghost, a whisper in a world of roaring engines and thunderous applause. His name was Leo, but in this place he was just the uniform, a blue-grey smudge you might see from the corner of your eye, wiping away the footprints of giants. Tonight, the giants were out in full force. They wore $1,000 suits and dresses that shimmered like liquid night. They smelled of expensive perfume and entitlement. And Leo's job was to make their world perfect, to erase any sign that the real world, his world, had ever touched this gleaming floor. The air in the Thorne Automotive flagship showroom was thick with anticipation. It was a cathedral of chrome and glass, a temple built to worship speed. And tonight was the holiest of nights, the unveiling of the Thorne Apex, a car that wasn't just a car, but a statement, a $1 million exclamation point on wheels. Leo moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. His cart, with its rattling bottles and worn-out mop, was the only thing that made a sound in his personal bubble of silence. He was 18, but his eyes were older. They carried the weight of late-night shifts and early-morning bus rides. They carried the worry for his mother, her cough a constant soft rhythm in their tiny apartment. Her medical bills were a mountain he was trying to climb with a teaspoon. So he cleaned. He polished the floors until they reflected the ambitions of the men and women who walked on them. He wiped down glass cases that held trophies from races he could only dream of watching. He was close to his dream, so close he could smell the leather and the new car scent of it all, but he was on the wrong side of the velvet rope. His dream wasn't to own these cars. It was to understand them, to know why a certain gear ratio created a symphony of power, or how an engine could breathe fire and still remain a machine, controllable and precise. Back home, his room was littered with old textbooks on mechanical engineering, salvaged from a dumpster behind the community college. He'd spend hours sketching engines, designing aerodynamic frames, fixing the neighbors' sputtering lawnmowers for a few extra dollars. He had a gift, a way of seeing the hidden language of machines. But here in this palace of automotive perfection, that gift was useless. Here he was just the help. He was meant to be deaf, dumb, and blind to the world he was preparing for others to enjoy. But Leo couldn't turn his eyes off. He saw everything. He saw the nervous tick of the junior executive, his smile just a little too wide. He saw the way the champagne flutes were arranged in a perfect, fragile pyramid. And he saw the small, almost imperceptible tremor in the hand of the lead security guard. He was a student of details. As the final guests arrived, Leo was tasked with one last sweep around the main attraction. The Thorne Apex sat on a raised, rotating platform, shrouded in a black silk cloth. It was the center of this universe. The lights were designed to hit it in a way that made it look like a sleeping beast. Leo pushed his mop, the rhythmic slosh of the water a stark contrast to the sophisticated murmur of the crowd. His boss had given him a stern warning. Don't look at the clients, don't speak unless spoken to, and whatever you do, do not get near that car. But as he got closer, he couldn't help but lift his gaze. It was more than a machine. It was a piece of art. Even under the cloth, its lines were aggressive, beautiful. He felt a pull, a deep, resonant hum in his chest. The same feeling he got when he solved a complex mechanical problem. It was a feeling of connection. He was so lost in the moment, he didn't notice the CEO, Marcus Thorne, stride onto the stage, a man who cast a shadow even in the brightest of lights. The world saw a king in his castle, but as Leo looked down at the base of the platform, his gifted eyes, the eyes that saw the unseen, noticed something else entirely. Something small, something wrong, something no one else could possibly have seen. And in a place where every detail was meant to be perfect, this tiny imperfection was the most dangerous thing in the room. Marcus Thorne owned the world, or at least he acted like he did. He stood on the brightly lit stage, his silhouette sharp against the massive screen bearing his own name. He was a man forged in the fires of ambition and polished by success. His suit was tailored with surgical precision. His watch was worth more than Leo's apartment building. And his smile was his greatest weapon. It could charm investors, disarm journalists, and, when necessary, cut down an underling without raising his voice. Tonight, that smile was set to dazzle. He was not just selling a car, he was selling a fantasy. The fantasy of power, of exclusivity, of being better than everyone else. He was selling himself. Innovation, he began, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that filled every corner of the showroom. It isn't just a word for us at Thorne Automotive. It is our religion." The crowd hung on every syllable. They were disciples at the feet of the high priest of horsepower. Marcus moved across the stage with the predatory grace of a panther, his gestures timed perfectly to his speech. He was a master showman. Backstage, however, the master was less composed. Just 10 minutes before his grand entrance, he had cornered his chief engineer, a man named Elias Vance. Elias was brilliant, cautious, and the only man in the company who wasn't completely terrified of Marcus. "I'm telling you, Marcus," Elias had said, his voice low and urgent, "we pushed the integration of the new kinetic battery too fast. We need another week of diagnostics. There's a potential for overheating in the conduit casing under extreme thermal load." Marcus had waved a dismissive hand, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Elias, potential doesn't move stock prices. Perfection does. The car is perfect. The launch is tonight. Are we clear?" He didn't wait for an answer, turning his back on the engineer. That was his way. His vision was the only one that mattered. He saw his employees not as collaborators, but as instruments to achieve his goals. If they worked, he kept them. If they faltered, he replaced them. He treated people like parts in his grand machine, and right now Elias felt like a faulty component, about to be discarded. This arrogance was the bedrock of his empire. It had pushed him to take risks others wouldn't, to demand a level of excellence that bordered on the impossible, but it also made him blind. He saw charts, profits, and headlines. He didn't see the nervous sweat on a junior designer's brow or the flicker of doubt in his lead engineer's eyes. On stage, he was flawless. He spoke of legacy, of passion, of breaking barriers. "The Thorne Apex is not a car," he boomed, gesturing toward the shrouded form on the platform. "It is the future, a future you can own." He was at the peak of his power, the king of his castle, surrounded by the court jesters and sycophants who made his world turn. He glanced for a moment at the front row. The journalists, the investors, the celebrity influencers, all of them, rapt. He owned this moment. He owned them. His eyes scanned past them, over the sea of adoring faces to the back of the room. For a split second, his gaze passed over a young man in a cleaner's uniform, a nobody, a piece of the scenery. He registered him for less than a nanosecond before his attention snapped back to the stage. Why would he ever look twice? That boy was part of a world he had spent his entire life clawing his way out of. A world of insignificance, a world that was to him completely and utterly invisible. He had no idea that the fate of his entire kingdom, his life's work, his very life, rested on the shoulders of that invisible boy. Marcus took a dramatic pause, letting the silence build. The energy in the room was electric. It was time. Time for the grand reveal. He was about to give the signal, to have the lights focus, to have the music swell, to pull back the silk and show them all his masterpiece. But a desperate boy at the back of the room was about to become the only thing standing between the king and a devastating fall. The world for Leo had shrunk. The glittering crowd, the booming voice of Marcus Thorne, the shimmering champagne flutes, it all faded into a dull, blurry background. His focus, his entire being, was lasered in on a single point at the base of the car's rotating platform. While wiping the perimeter, his eyes, trained by years of tinkering and fixing, had caught it. A shimmer. A distortion in the air just above the polished concrete, right beneath the rear axle of the shrouded Apex. He stopped. His mop handle rested against his chest. He squinted. It was a drip. A tiny, almost apologetic bead of liquid forming and falling every few seconds. Drip, drip, drip. The drops were clear and oily, hitting the floor and evaporating almost instantly, leaving behind a faint, dark spot that was nearly invisible against the dark grey concrete. He took a half step closer, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He leaned forward, pretending to inspect a scuff mark on the floor. He lowered his head and took a subtle sniff. The smell was sharp, chemical, and deeply, deeply familiar. It wasn't oil. It wasn't coolant. It was high-performance brake fluid. He knew that smell from his go-kart days, when a cracked line had nearly sent him careening into a wall. On its own, a small brake fluid leak was a problem, but not a catastrophe. Annoying but fixable, but it was where it was dripping that made the blood freeze in his veins. The Thorne Apex, as Marcus Thorne had just boasted on stage, wasn't just a gasoline-powered beast. It was a hybrid, a monster of engineering that combined a V12 engine, with a cutting-edge kinetic energy recovery system, a Kerr's battery pack. Leo had read the leaked design specs online weeks ago, devouring them with an almost religious fervor. He knew the layout of this car better than his own apartment. The main power conduit, a thick orange-cased cable channeling immense electrical currents from the battery to the drivetrain, ran directly underneath that rear axle, directly in the path of the drip. Brake fluid is corrosive. It can eat through wiring insulation over time, but more importantly, it's flammable. Not like gasoline, which needs a spark. Brake fluid, especially this high-grade synthetic stuff, just needs heat. Its flash point is dangerously low, and right now the car was being bathed in the intense heat of a dozen theatrical stage lights. The platform itself was warming up. The air was getting hotter. The dripping fluid was turning into a vapor, an invisible, explosive cloud concentrating around a high-voltage power line. It wasn't a possibility. It was a countdown. Leo's mind raced. He saw it playing out in his head like one of his engineering simulations. The heat would cause the fluid vapor to reach its flash point. The vapor would ignite. The fire would instantly compromise the insulation of the main power conduit. The high-voltage current would arc, short-circuiting the entire Kerr's battery pack. A lithium-ion battery pack of that size wouldn't just burn, it would explode. It would go off like a bomb made of metal, carbon fiber, and electricity, right in the middle of a room packed with people, right at the feet of Marcus Thorne. Leo stood up, his knuckles white where he gripped the mop. His breath was shallow. He looked from the tiny, deadly drip to the celebrating crowd. They were all smiling, completely oblivious. They were standing on the edge of a cliff and admiring the view. He had to tell someone. He had to make them see. He, the invisible boy, had to somehow make the king in his castle listen. He turned, his eyes darting around frantically, searching for a single person who might believe him. But he was about to learn that in a world built on status, a warning from a ghost is just a whisper in the wind. Panic is a cold fire. It burns through your veins, screaming for action, for movement, for anything. Leo felt that fire ignite. He dropped his mop. It clattered to the floor with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in his own ears, yet no one else even flinched. His first instinct was to find someone, anyone, with a uniform that suggested authority. He saw a security guard standing near the exit, a big man with a bored expression and an earpiece. Leo rushed toward him, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Sir," he said, his voice coming out breathless and shaky. "Sir, you have to stop this. There's a problem with the car." The guard didn't even look at him at first. His eyes were scanning the crowd, looking for threats in expensive suits, not in a cleaner's jumpsuit. He finally glanced down, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disdain. "What's that, son? Go back to your post. You're not supposed to be talking to the guests." "No, you don't understand," Leo pleaded, his voice rising with desperation. "It's the car. There's a leak. A fluid leak near the battery conduit. It's dangerous." He tried to put the engineering terms into simple words, but his panic was making him stumble. The guard just sighed, a deep, world-weary sound. "Kid, that car is $1 million piece of tech. It's been checked 100 times. Now get out of here before you get yourself in real trouble." He made a shooing motion with his hand, as if Leo were a stray dog. Dismissed, ignored. He was invisible. Frustration and fear warred inside Leo. He scanned the room again. He saw a woman with a clipboard and a headset, rushing past him. An event manager. She looked important. He stepped into her path. "Ma'am, please," he said. "You have to listen. The car on stage is going to catch fire." The woman stopped dead in her tracks, but not with concern, with pure fury. "What did you just say?" she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "Who are you? You are staff. You are not to move from your designated area, and you are absolutely not to speak to anyone unless it's to say, 'Excuse me.' Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in? Bothering guests, making up ridiculous stories." Leo tried to interject, "But it's true, I saw it. The brake fluid—" She cut him off, her voice low and sharp as a razor. "I don't care if you saw aliens climbing out of the engine. Get back to the service corridor right now, or I will personally call your supervisor and have you fired. Am I clear?" Her words hit him like a physical blow. Fired. The one word he couldn't afford to hear. The word that meant no medicine for his mom, no rent money, no hope. He could see it in her eyes. She didn't see a concerned person. She saw a problem to be managed, a piece of trash to be swept away. He was not a credible source. His uniform was a costume of incompetence. His youth was a mark of foolishness. The injustice of it was a bitter pill in his throat. He had the knowledge. He had seen the truth. But his social standing, his place in this glittering world, made his truth worthless. He was shouting a warning from the bottom of a well, and everyone above was deaf. He looked back at the stage. Marcus Thorne was nearing the climax of his speech, his hands outstretched as if embracing the future. The stage lights seemed to grow hotter, more intense. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken danger. Leo felt a profound sense of helplessness wash over him. He had done what he was supposed to do. He had tried to follow the rules, to go through the proper channels, and the channels were closed to him. The system was designed to keep people like him silent. He was just a boy with a mop, and in this world that meant he was nothing. He could walk away, he could go back to the service corridor, save his job, and let fate play its hand. It wouldn't be his fault. He tried. But then he thought of his mother, and her belief that doing the right thing was the only thing that mattered, no matter how hard it was. He looked at the unsuspecting faces in the crowd, all smiling, all in danger. He couldn't. He just couldn't walk away. He had one last option, but it would mean breaking every rule and sacrificing the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. Time was running out. Leo could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Every booming word from Marcus Thorne on stage was another tick of the clock. Every burst of polite laughter from the audience was another step closer to disaster. He could almost feel the heat from the stage lights on his own skin, imagining them baking the leaking fluid, coaxing it toward ignition. His mind was a frantic whirlwind of choices, each one worse than the last. He could obey the manager, retreat into the shadows, and keep his job. He would be safe. He would be able to pay for his mother's medicine this month. But the image of the explosion, the fire, the chaos, it wouldn't leave his mind. He would have to live with the knowledge that he stood by and did nothing, that he let his fear win. He would be just as invisible as they thought he was. Or he could do the unthinkable. He looked at the stage again. It was like a fortress. Security guards were positioned at every angle. Marcus Thorne was in his own world, basking in the glow of adoration. To get to him would be impossible. It was a stupid idea, a crazy idea, but it was the only idea he had left. The pleas of the invisible boy had been ignored. Maybe the actions of a desperate man would not be. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind of clarity that comes when you have nothing left to lose. He had already been threatened with being fired. What was worse? Losing his job or watching people get hurt, maybe even killed, because he was too scared to be seen. He thought of his father, a mechanic who had died a few years ago, who always told him, "Son, a man isn't measured by the clean shirt on his back, but by the integrity in his heart." The Thorne Apex is more than a car, Marcus was saying, his voice reaching a crescendo. It is a promise, the promise of a new dawn. The crowd erupted in applause. This was it, the moment of the reveal. The lights began to dim, all except for a tight, intensely bright ring of spotlights focusing on the shrouded car. The heat was now concentrated. A magnifying glass pointed at a tinderbox. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. It's now or never. He took a deep breath, his knuckles cracking as he clenched his fists. He broke into a run. He burst from the relative darkness at the edge of the room into the open space between the crowd and the stage. He was a blur of motion, a streak of blue-gray against the opulent backdrop. Shouts erupted from the crowd. People pointed. The security guards, startled out of their bored stupor, immediately saw the threat. A running man heading for the stage, heading for their billionaire CEO. "Stop!" Leo screamed, his voice raw and cracking with adrenaline. "Stop the show!" He wasn't even sure what he was saying, just that he had to make them stop. He dodged a startled guest, nearly tripping over a handbag. He could see the stage clearly now, Marcus Thorne's face shifting from triumphant pride to shocked confusion, then to pure, unadulterated rage. He was a few yards from the steps to the stage when the first guard hit him. The impact was like running into a brick wall. The air rushed out of his lungs, and he went down hard on the polished floor, his head smacking against the concrete with a sickening thud. The world swam for a second. He could feel hands grabbing him, pinning his arms behind his back, a knee pressing hard into his spine. He was trapped. He had failed. The lights were still hot. The music was beginning to swell for the reveal, and he was on the ground, silenced. But as they dragged him to his feet, a public spectacle of failure. He was about to make one last desperate cry into the void. The world snapped back into a chaotic, terrifying focus. Leo was being hauled to his feet, his arms wrenched painfully behind his back. The murmur of the crowd had turned into a cacophony of gasps and frantic whispers. Phones were up, cameras flashing, turning his personal terror into a public spectacle. He was no longer a ghost. He was the villain of the show, the crazed interloper who had ruined the perfect moment. His head throbbed from the impact with the floor. Through the forest of legs and security uniforms, he could see the stage. And on it, the face of Marcus Thorne contorted with a fury that was almost theatrical in its intensity. The showman had been upstaged. The king's coronation had been interrupted by a peasant. "Get him out of here," Marcus bellowed into the microphone, his voice booming through the sound system, each word a hammer blow of condemnation. "Get this street rat out of my sight, now!" The words "street rat" echoed in the silent hall, a brand of public humiliation seared onto Leo. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, judging him, dismissing him. He saw the event manager at the side of the stage, her face a mask of triumphant rage. She was probably already on the phone with his supervisor. He had not only failed to warn them, but he had also guaranteed his own ruin. Everything he had feared was coming true all at once. The security guards started dragging him away, their grips like iron vices. They were pulling him toward the service exit, back into the invisibility from which he had so recklessly emerged. His one shot was over. He struggled against their grip, a useless, frantic motion. "No, please, listen," he gasped, but his voice was lost in the noise. They were moving too fast. In a few seconds, he'd be through the doors and it would be too late. The stage lights were still blazing. The heat was still building. The countdown was still ticking in his head. This was his last chance, the last ounce of air in his lungs. He twisted his head, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, and screamed, not just with his voice, but with every fiber of his being. It wasn't a plea this time. It was a statement, a fact. A piece of raw data fired like a bullet into the chaos. He didn't just shout fire. He shouted the why. He used the language he knew, the language of machines, the language of truth. It was the only weapon he had left. He screamed the words that had been churning in his mind, the specific technical detail that was the key to the entire disaster. The accusation had been made, the sentence passed. He was a lunatic, a nobody who had lost his mind. The media, initially capturing the drama of the interruption, now saw it as just that, a disturbed young man creating a scene. The narrative was already being written in their minds, but Leo's final, desperate shout was not meant for the crowd or the media, or even for Marcus Thorne. It was aimed unknowingly at the one other person in the room who spoke the same language, the one other person who understood the terrifying grammar of engineering failure, and that one person was listening. In the deafening chaos, his single specific sentence cut through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel and was about to change everything. "The brake line is leaking onto the battery conduit. It's going to ignite." Leo's scream, raw and technical, sliced through the confused din of the showroom. To most people, it was gibberish, a string of nonsensical words from a crazy person. The security guards didn't pause. The crowd continued to buzz with shocked excitement. Marcus Thorne on stage simply shook his head in disgust, turning to signal his staff to get the event back on track. But one man froze. Backstage, in the wings, Chief Engineer Elias Vance heard the words, and they hit him with the force of a physical blow. Brake line, battery conduit. It wasn't a vague warning of fire. It was a specific, terrifying diagnosis. It was the exact failure point he had worried about, the rushed integration, the proximity of the fluid lines to the high-voltage KERS cabling. He had warned Marcus about the potential for a thermal event, and this boy, this cleaner, had just described the precise mechanism of that event. A janitor shouldn't know what a battery conduit is. A street rat shouldn't be able to identify a brake fluid leak from 20 yards away and understand its implication for a hybrid power system, unless it was true. In that split second, Elias's professional terror eclipsed his fear of Marcus Thorne. He burst from the wings, his face pale with horror. "He's right," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Shut it down! Kill the power to the stage! Now!" He wasn't asking. He was commanding. The authority in his voice, the sheer panic from a man known for his calm, methodical nature, was enough to stop everyone in their tracks. The event manager, who had been signaling for security to hurry, stared at him dumbfounded. The security guards holding Leo paused, their hands still gripping his arms, but their momentum gone. Marcus Thorne spun around, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Elias, what in God's name are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" But Elias was already moving, pushing past a stagehand to get to the emergency power cutoff. "There's no time," he shouted back at Marcus. He knew the specific parts, Marcus. He knew. With a decisive motion, he slammed his hand down on the large red button. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The thunderous music died. The dazzling spotlights went black. The massive video screen behind the stage flickered and went dark. The entire presentation was plunged into the dim, ambient light of the showroom's safety lighting. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The magic was broken. The silence was heavy, absolute and terrifying. In that sudden, eerie quiet, a new sound could be heard. A faint, sharp hissing. And from under the silk cloth covering the million-dollar hypercar, a thin, greasy wisp of white smoke began to curl upwards, illuminated by the emergency lights. Then a smell. Acrid, chemical, the smell of something burning that shouldn't be. The truth was now undeniable. It wasn't a theory. It wasn't a madman's ranting. It was real. Elias and two technicians scrambled onto the platform. They ripped the silk cloth off the Thorne Apex, revealing its sleek, beautiful body. And there, at the back, just as Leo had described, was the drip. The small puddle of brake fluid on the floor was now sizzling, vaporizing from the heat of the conduit casing beneath it. The insulation on the thick orange cable was smoking, beginning to blacken and melt. They were seconds away from an inferno. The king stood frozen on his darkened stage, staring at the smoking symbol of his ambition, the silence of the room broken only by the sound of his world almost ending. The silence didn't last long. It was shattered by a single, sharp command from Elias. "Fire extinguishers, CO2, now!" Technicians swarmed the stage, not with polishing cloths, but with red canisters. They discharged a cloud of icy carbon dioxide onto the rear of the car, instantly smothering the smoking conduit and cooling the volatile components. The immediate danger was over, but a new kind of chaos was just beginning. Panic, once held at bay by the spectacle, now rippled through the crowd. People started moving toward the exits, not in a stampede, but with a nervous, urgent energy. The party was over. The dream had become a nightmare. Marcus Thorne stood motionless on the stage, a statue carved from shock. The lights were gone, the applause was gone, his triumphant speech was a forgotten echo. All that remained was the acrid smell of burnt plastic and the chilling reality of what had almost happened. He watched Elias and his team work on the car, their faces grim. Elias pointed to the dripping line, then to the scorched conduit casing, explaining the chain of events to a horrified-looking Marcus. He didn't need the explanation. He had seen the smoke. He had heard the hiss. He finally truly understood. This wasn't a minor glitch. This was a near catastrophe. Lives had been at stake. His life had been at stake. And the person who saved him, the person who saved everyone, was the same boy he had publicly humiliated just moments before. He turned his head slowly, his eyes scanning the room for Leo. He found him. The security guards had released their grip, but still stood beside him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and shock. Leo wasn't looking at the car. He was looking at the floor, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. He looked small, terrified, and utterly broken. The image of Leo being held by security, bruised and afraid, was now burned into Marcus's mind, right next to the image of the smoking car. The contrast was sickening. One moment, he was the powerful CEO condemning a street rat. The next, he was a man who owed his life to that same boy's courage and impossible knowledge. The arrogance that had been his armor for decades cracked, then shattered. Humiliation washed over him, but it was a different kind, not the anger of being upstaged, but the profound shame of his own blindness. How could he have been so wrong? How could he have looked at that boy and seen nothing? The PR team was already in motion, whispering into their phones, crafting a narrative. A minor technical issue. Precautionary measures. Guest safety is our top priority. They would spin it. They would control it. They would bury the truth under a mountain of press releases. But Marcus knew the truth. Elias knew the truth. And most importantly, Leo knew the truth. The building was emptying now. The beautiful people were fleeing his beautiful showroom. The launch was a disaster. The stock would plummet tomorrow. His reputation was in tatters. But as Marcus Thorne stood there amidst the wreckage of his perfect night, none of that seemed to matter. The only thing he could see was the face of the young cleaning boy, the ghost who had roared. He took a step off the stage, then another, his expensive leather shoes feeling heavy, as if walking through deep mud. He ignored his PR team, his executives, everyone. He had to get to the boy. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know how to fix what he had done, but he knew he had to try. The night of the grand launch was over, but for Marcus Thorne and the invisible boy, the morning of reckoning was just about to begin. The next day, the city buzzed with news of the Thorne Apex launch, but the story was a sanitized fiction. "Minor electrical fault halts gala," read one headline. "Thorne Automotive puts safety first," read another. The PR machine had worked overnight, transforming a near disaster into a story of corporate responsibility. The narrative had been set, and Leo, the boy at the center of it all, had been completely erased from the picture. As far as the world was concerned, he had never existed. Leo woke up that morning to a phone call from his supervisor. He was fired. The reasons were vague: creating a disturbance, unprofessional conduct, violating company policy. It was exactly what he had expected. He didn't argue. He just said okay and hung up. He sat on the edge of his bed in his small, cluttered room, the morning light filtering through the dusty blinds. He had saved them all, and his reward was unemployment. The injustice of it was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Later that afternoon, there was a knock on his apartment door. It was a hesitant, uncertain knock. Leo opened it to find Marcus Thorne standing in the dingy hallway of his building. He wasn't wearing a perfect suit. He was in simple slacks and a sweater, looking older, tired, and profoundly out of place. He wasn't flanked by security or assistants. He was alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Leo just stared, his mind struggling to process the sight of the billionaire standing on his worn-out welcome mat. "Leo?" Marcus began, his voice quiet, stripped of all its usual booming confidence. Can I come in?" Leo stepped aside, and Marcus entered the tiny apartment. His eyes took in the stacks of old engineering textbooks, the sketches of engines taped to the wall, the faint smell of his mother's herbal tea. He was seeing, for the first time, the world of the boy he had dismissed. "I came here," Marcus said, turning to face Leo, "to apologize. But the words, 'I'm sorry,' feel small, pathetic for what I did." He looked directly at Leo, his gaze unwavering. "I humiliated you, I endangered you, I was arrogant, I was blind, and I was wrong, terribly, unforgivably wrong." It wasn't a corporate apology. It was personal, raw, and deeply sincere. "How?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "How did you know?" "My chief engineer, a man with 30 years of experience, had a vague worry. You saw the exact point of failure from across a crowded room. Please explain it to me." And so Leo, standing in his own small room, began to talk. He spoke of his passion for mechanics, of studying designs online, of knowing the Apex's layout. He explained the properties of brake fluid, the concept of a flashpoint, the danger to the conduit. He wasn't boasting. He was simply explaining the truth as he saw it. Marcus Thorne listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't check his phone. He just listened with an intensity that he usually reserved for board meetings. He wasn't listening to a cleaner. He was listening to an engineer. He was seeing the brilliance he had almost thrown away. When Leo finished, Marcus was silent for a long moment. "I built an empire on the idea that I was the only one with the vision," he said softly. "Yesterday I stood on a stage and called myself an innovator. But you, Leo, you are the real thing. You have a gift I almost crushed." He then told Leo that he had already called his former supervisor and had him fired for his treatment of Leo. He told him the security guards who manhandled him were being retrained, but he knew that wasn't enough. It was just cleaning up a mess. It wasn't justice. What he proposed next wasn't just an apology or a reward, but an act of true redemption that would change both of their lives forever. "An apology is worthless without action," Marcus Thorne said, his voice resonating with a newfound conviction in the small apartment. "Paying you for your silence would be the ultimate insult. Your voice is the one thing I should have listened to from the start." He looked around the room again at the evidence of a brilliant mind starved of opportunity. I owe you a debt, not just for saving my company, but for saving me from my own ignorance, and it's a debt I intend to repay." He then laid out his offer. It wasn't just a job, it was a future. First, he was establishing the Thorne Excellence Scholarship, a full-ride program for gifted engineering students from underprivileged backgrounds, and Leo would be its first-ever recipient. He would attend the top engineering university in the country, all expenses paid. Every book, every fee, every single cost would be covered. But that was only the beginning. Marcus also offered him a paid internship at Thorne Automotive, starting immediately, that would continue throughout his university career. It wouldn't be making coffee, he would be working directly with the research and development team, directly with Elias Vance. He would have a seat at the table, he would have a voice, and finally, Marcus made him a personal promise. "I will be your mentor," he said, "if you'll have me. I have a lot to teach about running a company, but I have a lot more to learn from you about integrity and vision." Leo was speechless. It was more than he had ever dared to dream. The world that had been so cruelly shut to him was now being thrown wide open. That afternoon, Marcus Thorne held a press conference. He walked to the podium and did something no one expected. He told the truth, the whole truth. He described the leak, the near disaster, and his own unforgivable behavior. And then he introduced the world to his hero. He called Leo to the stage, not as a cleaner, not as a street rat, but as the young man who saved them all. The flashes of the cameras were just as bright as the night before, but this time they weren't capturing a moment of humiliation. They were capturing a moment of profound emotional justice. The final scene of this story isn't in a glitzy showroom. Say it's 6 months later, in the clean, bright light of an advanced engineering lab at Thorne Automotive. Leo, now a university student, is no longer in a blue-grey jumpsuit. He's wearing a lab coat, leaning over a holographic projection of a new engine design. He's pointing to a specific component, explaining a potential improvement with quiet confidence. And standing next to him, listening with respect and admiration, is Marcus Thorne. He isn't the king of the castle anymore. He's a mentor, a colleague, and a man humbled and made better by the boy he once refused to see. Leo's mother is getting the best medical care. Their lives have been transformed, but the real change wasn't just in their circumstances. It was in the world's perception. The story of the cleaning boy who saved the millionaire became a legend. A powerful reminder that heroes are not defined by the clothes they wear or the job they hold. They are defined by their courage to speak the truth, especially when no one is listening. It's a lesson that value, brilliance, and integrity can be found in the most unexpected places, if only we have the wisdom to look, to truly see the person, not the uniform.